when this issue goes before the people of Australia later this year, everyone will have the opportunity to individually have their say by way of a vote, and that is a good thing. And I do urge and encourage people to cast their vote based on their own views, formed by their own research into this issue. I've had many correspondents from my electorate, and indeed from elsewhere, who have written to me with a view on the voice, and I do thank them for their correspondence, I do. And whilst people will have strong opinions one way or the other regarding the voice, and others may have yet to even have made up their mind, I've consistently said in public I hope the referendum and ensuing debate does not cause division within our nation. I do fear that it has already done so in some circumstances. I do fear and know that some have used this to drive a wedge into Australia's psyche, into Australia's conscience, and that is a shame. People are entitled to be in favour or indeed opposed to the voice. That is the great aspect about living in a free democracy. But it would be best if debate on this matter does not continue to, or even worsen the divide within the nation. Divergent views are fine, but let's keep the debate respectful and at all times tolerant. I remain deeply concerned about what the voice will do to our country and the way in which we are governed. I do. The Nationals came out prior to the end of last year, late last year, with a party view on the voice. And there were some who were very pleased at the fact that we did just that, and there were some who were concerned about why we did that. I'll tell you why we did that is because had we not had the discussion, I can imagine over the Christmas period where things should be on other matters and people should be worrying about family reunions and the like, we would have been picked off by the media one by one and would have caused a huge debate and uproar about where we stand individually, where we stand collectively on this matter. And we took the valued and principled position that we would say what we thought as a party. And the Nationals recognise the immense challenges impacting many Indigenous communities, including domestic and family violence, healthcare, substance abuse, child safety, education, housing and unemployment. One of the things that the Nationals were very concerned about was the withdrawal of the cashless welfare debit card. We know what a difference it made to the communities we serve. We know what a difference it made because we are on the ground talking to people, talking to families, talking to particularly women in those families who saw the impact of alcohol and substance abuse lessen, reduce, who saw the difference it made in their ability to send their kids to school with what they needed as far as uniforms, school educational resources, indeed even food in their stomachs for, in many cases, the first time for a long time. And yet this government decided to take that away, take that opportunity away. Australia has had an Indigenous representative bureaucracy before. It was called ATSIC, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission. It was notorious for its inefficiency, its wastefulness and its dysfunction. It was. There are already many Indigenous voices. In the 47th Parliament, there are 227 elected representatives, both in the Senate and here in the House of Representatives. Amongst those are 11 elected by the people Indigenous members, and that is a good thing. That is representative. There's also a Minister for Indigenous Australians who's overseeing a $1 billion federal department. Additionally, we have the Prime Minister's Indigenous Advisory Council, we have land councils, we have more than 3,500 Aboriginal corporations and the National Coalition of Peaks, representing about 80 top Aboriginal organisations, groups which already have an influence and have an impact and give advice and offer support to our decision-making here in this place in Canberra. And we believe, as Nationals, that adding another layer of bureaucracy in Canberra won't genuinely close the gap for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island Australians. The Nationals want to address the serious issues affecting Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Australians by delivering frontline, evidence-based and place-based solutions which will help lift Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people out of poverty. We want local decisions, not Canberra-led bureaucracy telling Aboriginal people what's good for them and what's not good for them. We want to stimulate economic participation, generate jobs, improve access to education, enhance the provision of health services and eliminate domestic and family violence. And when I talk about jobs, I talk about such projects as the Inland Rail. 302 Indigenous people worked on the Narromine to Parkes first stage of 13 tranches of the Inland Rail. Now, 197 of those were local Indigenous workers. For some, many, perhaps even most, it was an opportunity they would obviously not have otherwise had, but also their first jobs. And I know that the Snowy Hydro 2.0, for many of those Aboriginal people who worked on that particular project and still are, it was their first job they ever had. And they were so proud when I went to the Wagga Wagga beach and talked to a number of them who had been trained, were ready to don the high vis and whatever else and get their way up to Cooma and Tumut and Talbingo and elsewhere and start on that project. But for Inland Rail, this was particularly important because it was nation building, and so many of those people who talked to me, Aboriginal people, who were taking up opportunities, taking up job opportunities, as I say, nearly 200 of them as local residents of both the Riverina and Central West, said to me that they were so excited this was going to make such a difference to their families. And that's why I am really alarmed by the fact that, and I'm not making a political statement here, I'm just making a factual statement, the fact that so many of these infrastructure projects are now on hold because of the 90-day review put in place by the Minister, because that's 90 days of uncertainty for those Aboriginal people. And I fear that the Inland Rail is just going to stop where it is, stop in its tracks, pardon the pun. And like many people, like everybody in here, should be really wanting that project to go ahead, not just because it's a great project, but for the fact that it's going to provide such great enhancements and opportunities for Aboriginal people. We believe, as Nationals, that the bureaucracy should leave Canberra and visit communities around regional and rural town halls and campfires instead of bureaucracy coming to Canberra. Each community has vastly different needs, and I know that because I've been to Tennant Creek, I've been to Katherine, I've been to Alice Springs, I've been to Mornington Island in the Gulf of Carpentaria, where the mayor there, Kyle Yanna, just wants a swimming pool, just wants an aquatic centre. Now, the Voice isn't going to provide that. Infrastructure investments will. And I know that referenda are supposed to be about detail. I know that Australians generally don't like their founding document to be changed, and that's for a good reason. The Constitution gets interpreted by the High Court, and I believe, and the Nationals believe, it's absolutely essential we take a sensible, considered, serious and orthodox approach to what is being proposed by examining the available material and detail, not that there's been enough, not that there's been too much at all. On this matter, it is evident the federal government is severely lacking in the detail that they have needed to provide. But don't just take my word for it. I spoke recently and spent the afternoon, most of the afternoon at a football game with Hewitt Wyman, wonderful fellow, Aboriginal fellow who served our nation in Vietnam, came back and trained soldiers at Kapooka, home of the soldier. And Hugh will be voting for the Voice. He told me that at this stage he was in favour of it, but he didn't have the detail. And he said, well, I appreciate it. It may well lead to benefits for us in the long run. He said, I'd really like to see more detail. Now, I understand where he's coming from. I respect his view. I know that Auntie Cheryl Penrith from Wagga Wagga local Wiradjuri elder. I always pay my respects to Wiradjuri people. She said, "We First Nations people are not the people who are ultimately going to decide this. Everyone gets a vote, including Michael," she told the Daily Advertiser, the local newspaper, that being me. This is something that we will be seen on the world stage, and I think we need to have a think about what we want the country to look like. So I respect her view. I do. I know that Jacinta Price is leading the campaign against the Voice, and she has lived experience. I very much value the views that she has put across publicly, understand exactly from where she's coming. She's an outstanding Australian. And I take on board all the constituents, all my local constituents, such as Kevin Smith from Forbes, who told me that he's totally against the Voice. It will divide races. We are all Australian, no matter who we are. Len Oliver of Cowra said from his conversations with people there appeared to be almost no information or detail on the Voice, and everyone he'd spoken with about this matter did not want any changes to the Constitution under any circumstances. I also know that amongst the dialogue discussions and regional consultation that took place to devise the statement, the Uluru Statement of the Heart, that my electorate was not represented in those. In fact, the closest was Dubbo, which is a long, long way from Wagga Wagga. And that's a shame, because when we talk about local influence and regional influence, it is a shame that one of the largest Wiradjuri electorates, indeed an electorate which at the census of 2021 had a little over 12,000 Aboriginal people in it, was not represented in that dialogue, those dozen dialogue discussions and one regional consultation to take place. At the end of the day, everyone will have their chance to have their say via the ballot box, and as I said at the outset, that's a good thing. And whatever the result, I hope that all Australians work together to build a better nation, one in which we can all thrive. And I do want to make and take issue with some of the virtue signalling organisations, such as our sporting organisations, including the Australian Football League and the National Rugby League, because particularly in the northern reaches of my electorate, sometimes you see Aboriginal footballers and others in the Northern Riverine League who can barely get to games because of the wide travelling that they need to do, but can't even afford a pair of footy boots. And yet we have the displays that we did, and the Indigenous round was quite entertaining. I appreciate that, both the spectacle before the game and, of course, the close contests on the field. But when the AFL comes out and has that and spends that amount of money, I would love to see them spend a little bit more attention on the outer reaches of their country communities who give so much to the great national sport that Australian football is. And when it comes to the rugby league, and I listened closely to the member for Parkes, he and his wife Robin have bought jumpers for a couple of football clubs so that they could field teams, and yet they're disappointed too that the NRL doesn't always extend the reach and extend the support and the finances to some of those Aboriginal communities which love their rugby league, absolutely love their rugby league. And then you've got, of course, the banks who are closing branches and calling it property consolidation, and that's great because it's lowering emissions. I mean, I cannot even fathom that as to one of the reasons why bank closure seems to be a good thing. But they're closing banks in areas where they're so sorely needed by Aboriginal people. That, to me, is just unforgivable and unfathomable. And one figure I heard bandied about earlier today was 92 branches of major banks being closed in country areas in just the last 9 months, and that is terrible, and it's particularly terrible for Aboriginal people who use those banking services, and simply not good enough. But everybody's going to have their say. That is a good thing, and I just hope that whatever the result is, that we can genuinely and earnestly and honestly and passionately work together to continue to close the gap. We're not doing good enough at the moment. We are not. And I'm not sure the Voice is going to, if it does get up, succeed in closing the gap. But there are challenges out there. The removal of the cashless welfare debit card did not help our Aboriginal people or communities, and I'm not so sure the Voice will if it gets up either. Authorised by Michael McCormack, the National Party, Wagga Wagga.